I want to welcome everyone to the Politics of Kink at Pride panel. Um, Thank you so much for coming, for attending yet another virtual event. This event's being hosted in collaboration with the YFS, CSACs, and Table Gay. Before we start, I'd just like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So, today we acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis Nation. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. If you're interested in figuring out who is the caretaker of your region, of the region that you live on, I suggest checking out native-land.ca. It's really cool. It'll tell you exactly, what treaties the area that you live in is under. So I think it's important that we highlight that not only is June Pride Month, it's also Indigenous History Month. And central to acknowledging that is using our privilege as settlers on Turtle Island to amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples, both inside and outside the 2S LGBTQ community. Additionally, we must recognize that now more than ever, the lasting legacy of colonialism impacts us all. We, as settlers, must continue to do our part on this land by working with the original owners of this land to dismantle the binds of colonization and actively work to reconcile our minds, thoughts, and actions. I'd also like to include an equity statement before we get into the groups responsible for this panel. Through collective action, we are able to combat all forms of discrimination and harassment. We show no tolerance for hate speech rooted in, but not limited to, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, racism, classism, ableism, homophobia, transphobic sentiments, or remarks. We all have an obligation to ensure that we continue to create and cultivate open and inclusive spaces in an effort to combat all forms of racism, discrimination, and harassment in our spaces. Okay, so this is going to be a little introduction to what this panel is going to be about. Hopefully you read the title of it, so it's not like a surprise to you. Table Gay, YFS, and CSACs decided to organize this panel to discuss something that's been a very hot topic as of late on social media as well as in queer-made spaces. We want to have an open and honest discussion on the role of kink at Pride and the politics behind both the presence and the pushback of the kink community, as well as the role kink has in the queer sexual liberation movement. So about the groups. Table Gay, or TBLGAY, I say Table Gay because I am beyond reform, means trans, bisexual, lesbian, gay, asexual at York, and it's a student-run community service group. We are funded and we operate under the York Federation of Students, that's YFS, to offer resources and support for the queer, trans, and asexual. The YFS is the York Federation of Students, and it's the Central Undergraduate Student Union representing over 50,000 students at York University. Through its 4 pillars, services, advocacy, events, and clubs, and with an equitable and anti-oppressive lens, the YFS works to ensure that undergraduate students at York University have an all-encompassing and holistic student experience. They also sometimes pay for your printing, which has helped me a lot. CSACs. So CSACs is the Continuing Education Students Association of X University at X University. CSACs represents part-time and continuing education students at the former Ryerson University. In the goal of both real truth and real reconciliation, Indigenous students at X University are calling for a change of the university name due to the namesake being the architect of the residential school system. To learn more, visit www.mycesar.ca/xuniversity. And don't worry, if I talk too fast and you couldn't get it, I will put it in the chat later on. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the people who were bringing this panel, but now I'm going to talk a bit about our wonderful speakers today, who you are all seeing their beautiful faces. So first, Jade Niles-Craig is a multi-disciplinary comedic performer with a background in music, theater, and you guessed it, musical theater. Now, regularly doing stand up and hosting various events, they will say yes to pretty much anything that involves stage time, obviously virtual right now. And on the off chance that Jade isn't performing, they can likely be found somewhere cozy crying into a cheesecake. Welcome, Jade.
Hi. Sorry, I was just trying to find that unmute button. I forgot that I put that cheesecake bit into my bio, which is funny because I entered this meeting a few minutes late because I was eating cheese. So we love to stay on brand. Yes, I'm a comedian, event host. When it's safe, I'm a karaoke host. I'm a Libra. I'm single. Just dropping the important information. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you. Sarah Rayner is currently a graduate student at Trent University, where they are currently completing their master's degree in cultural studies and where they will be starting their PhD in the fall. They currently reside in Peterborough and are an educator, researcher, and community worker. They love to facilitate workshops and discussions around gender and sexuality, anti-oppression, and queer and feminist histories, as well as anything arts-based and interactive. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi. Yeah, I have been studying sex and sexuality as part of all my degrees to some extent over the past 2 years. And I'm excited to be here. And I'm single and an Aquarius.
Thank you. Luna Matatas is a sex and pleasure educator with over 15 years of experience teaching sex and empowerment workshops. She celebrates body confidence, self-adoration, and building shame-free pleasure in and out of the bedroom. She teaches a wide range of topics, including threesomes, BDSM, and sexual confidence. Luna hosts The Plug, an anal sex podcast by B-Vibe. She created Peg the Patriarchy and Meditate, Medicate, Masturbate brands as part of her sex-positive and feminist merchandise. Welcome, Luna.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love this topic, so I can't wait to hear all the amazing perspectives and questions on this. And I'm going to disappoint the air signs. I'm a Capricorn and I'm single, but Capricorn, I don't know. I feel kind of scared now. I'm attracted to air signs. I don't know. Does that help? Did this just become something else?
This is actually a mixer. It was a surprise, a mixer that people now are forced to watch. So thank you. With that, and with welcoming, astrology is gay. That's a fact. With that, welcoming our speakers, I'm going to move into our little structured session. So this is going to be where I ask you guys some questions and hopefully get your opinions on it. And then later on, we'll move into our audience Q&A, where our audience can submit questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. So hopefully you can spend a little time getting to know that, and I'll take care of the rest right now. So I think I'm going to start off with asking something that'll kind of, get into the topic of kink. So how would you best describe kink to someone who is new to the concept or doesn't consider themselves a kinky person? Which areas of kink are you most engaged in, and where have those practices emerged from? I'm going to ask Luna first.
Yeah, it's such a great question because I think sometimes the mainstream representations of kink that we see are very sensationalized. They're very heteronormative. They're, very much, it feels inaccessible. And sometimes that can be inspiring to see something kind of bigger and find yourself turned on to this, but to feel like you don't belong in it, that sort of, it cuts into your pleasure. It cuts into your capacity for expansion through kink. And so if you're just getting started with kink, I tend to, and I think this goes for if you're just getting started or if you're trying to refresh your kink, or, I think sometimes experience is equated to skill, and that's not necessarily true. So there's always something for us to learn. And I think I describe it as this really fun way to engage your imagination with an erotic reward. And so you get all of this opportunity to play through things like role play or character attributes, or, mixing up what you normally access from yourself. So maybe you always access a really powerful side, and now you want to submit in a surrendered way. And then you get this erotic reward, which doesn't have to necessarily be sexual. So the eroticism that can come from it is connecting that mind-body experience. It's exploring sensations. It's exploring, what are my senses as these little portals of pleasure. And so for a lot of people, kink could just be spanking their partner. And for other people, it means, shibari and hanging people from the ceiling, and that's all okay. That's all part of it. But sometimes we see this pressure to define and belong according to how extreme our kink is, and I definitely felt that as well. So the second part of the question, I was not kinky growing up, or what I would have described as kinky. But if you have fantasies, you could be kinky. If you have like ideas about things you would like to try, for some people anal is kinky, and for other people it's not. And so it's just this idea, if you get this creative erotic urge, then that can be your definition of kinky. And so I was curious about power. I thought, cool, like I'd always masturbated and thought about submission, because that's what we see. I was reading my mom's dirty books, and they were about some, cis woman being flung on the bed and her blouse pops open and she has an orgasm. And I was like, okay, like, is this all we have to do? And so when I discovered that was just one iteration of kink, and I saw all these other ways to have it offer me different things, then I just wanted to try everything. And so I teach like over 30 classes. I'd say half of them are kinky, and I don't teach anything that I don't do or that I enjoy doing. Whether or not I do it to the level someone else might do it, that might be debatable. It's about taking the skills that interest us most and make us feel most like growing and sexy and expanding.
That is speak. Sarah, would you like to share a little bit about what areas of kink you're most engaged in?
Yeah, that's gonna be so hard to follow. Yeah, like Luna said, kink is such a broad thing. It's such a broad spectrum of things. Normally when I'm doing a workshop and I have to define what kink is, I just say it's a broad concept that encompasses pretty much any form of sexual expression that falls outside the mainstream. And what I'm most engaged in personally is, like, I'm a non-binary lesbian, and I'm really into gender play now, more or less. It can look like a bunch of different things depending on who I'm with. And just power play, power dynamics has always been of interest to me. And I've really started exploring that the past few years specifically. But yeah, I'm pretty much always open to trying new things. So I'm also at that stage. But yeah.
So the definitions of kink rely on the person defining it, right? Okay, so Jade, could you talk a little bit more about your definition of kink?
I would definitely agree that it's really any form of sexual expression or exploration that falls outside of the mainstream or what is typically represented. A lot of people only have consumed media that represents kink in the form of BDSM, specifically with male doms and women who are submitting. It also misses a lot of very, very important aspects of it. I have yet to see any representation of kink that includes aftercare, for example. I also think that a written contract is like, I mean, obviously I'm talking about 50 Shades of Grey, and there's 1 million things wrong with that. But there's just a lot of aspects that are, again, as Luna said, sensationalized and not accurate representations, but they're sort of brought into the mainstream to be viewed as quirky and exciting and kind of dark. And to me, kink is really, like, the kink community is so wholesome, and to refer to kink in like a dark way, like, yeah, it can be dark if you want it to be dark, but what word am I looking for here? I guess the, not goal, but I guess the goal of kink is to explore parts of yourself in a warm, welcoming, safe environment with a partner or many partners who are providing you with that warm, safe environment. And it involves a lot of consent, a lot of communication outside of the typical aspects of what we consider to be sex, whether it's queer sex or straight sex.
That's great. Jade, you mentioned that mainstream kink looks a certain way right now, and that as far as the discussion goes in the popular culture and how we understand kink right now, we're kind of getting a one story kind of thing, right? So I'm going to direct this to Sarah. Sarah, could you speak more to the history of queer communities and kink practices prior to the inception of Pride? So, like, a little different from how mainstream has been focusing on it so far.
Yeah, for sure. I can speak a bit about this. So decades ago, prior to Stonewall and the bathhouse raids in Toronto and other moments that are often seen as the beginnings of Pride, there was a division, which was basically the heteronormative and what was viewed as normal, and everyone else, which included queer people, trans people, drag queens, drag kings, sex workers, and kinky people. Because of this, kink communities and queer communities were both othered in similar ways, similar but different ways. Queer and kink communities found a common bond in the freedom to develop new and unique ways of relating to one another within their communities. And within kinky subcultures, participants have had to create their own traditions, practices, and even language to connect and express who they are and how they feel, such as the hanky code and social signs, and so is the queer community. So there is a pretty deep history and some overlap prior to Pride between the two communities.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. That is incredible. Like, I really do like the point that you said about like defining it for yourself and using a different kind of language and how it changes depending on the people. So Jade, do you want to talk about your understanding of queer communities and kink practices in the past?
I can't speak in detail to before Pride per se, but I can say that something that queer community and the kink community have always had in common is that they've been told to hide from the mainstream. They were told that they didn't deserve representation, that what they were doing was dirty, was wrong, was in some way against, maybe spiritually and against God or whatever you believe in. And so those two communities have always had in common that something that is meant to, something that's really just an expression of joy and self-care and love is portrayed as something that's very dark and unhealthy and dangerous and immoral. And that's, I mean, we'll talk about it as we go on with the panel, but that's why I think that this is such a hot topic lately, is people are not understanding the bridge between the two communities, and also that the two communities are really just one community. Not every queer person is kinky, not every kinky person is queer, but we all kind of see each other and we know that there's a lot of similar experiences belonging to one of those communities.
Right, there's a lot of parallels between the kink and the queer community. Luna, do you want to talk to some of those parallels? To some, yeah.
And I love the points that Sarah and Jade bring up, because it does talk about this sense of belonging through a shared experience, and so we get this community kind of acceptance when the world is telling us that, you know, we're not okay, this is deviant, this is you know, not acceptable. And so this like acceptability politic garbage kind of comes up when we look at both communities independently or where they intersect. And I think it's also important to note that, you know, kink isn't inherently inclusive either. Like, it's the kink community has tons of problems, and it does go back to when communities started to form around shared interests like kink. And so we had, you know, very cis white men who were leather daddies, and very much like the leather community is still pretty exclusive. And it's really interesting to see how we can have opportunities to use things like kink and pride to be able to lift up especially the most marginalized and inaccessible parts of our communities. But I think sometimes there is really still this dominant focus on a hierarchy of like a particular part of the community. If you scroll any fetish festival, you see, whether they're at Pride or not, I mean, they look a certain color, you know, they're often cis people, they're no, we don't have we don't see disability represented. We don't see a lot of stuff in kink communities because it often is formed on aesthetics. And so, where's my plus size latex that's easily, found? Where are we, where's nude in my color? So sometimes it's also about can I get into the community? And when you first start with kink, it can feel very much that you have to assimilate or it's not for you. And then you think that, oh, maybe kink, I thought kink was just for white cis people. And when I got onto FetLife and I was like, where are all the queers? Where are all the people of color? Where are all the dominant people of color? There was just so much that I didn't have an analysis of. And so coming into it at first, it can feel very exclusive, even though you're seeking out this inclusion.
Luna, I really like what you said about assimilation. And I think that really leads into the next question, is that it kind of feels like assimilate or get out. You know what I mean? So on that topic, in the time of a depoliticized rainbow wash pride parades that technically usually do look a certain way, why is it important that we center kinky narratives, diverse relationship dynamics, and visible expressions of kink culture in the celebration of Pride Month? I'm going to direct that to Jade first. Yeah.
One of the main reasons that I think it's really important, again, is because of the history where this community was told to hide. It wasn't just spaces where queer people gathered that were raided and imposed on by the police. It was places, essentially. It was places where people are expressing themselves sexually. And you weren't able to do that necessarily in your home. There was a lot of people who were in a closet. There were a lot of people who were not out. And there were also a lot of places where you could explore certain things just to find out what was right for you that involved kink. There weren't a lot of vanilla bathhouses in my knowledge, but I think the thing is that diverse relationship representation in queerness, of course, we're not talking about interracial straight couples at Pride, is really important because this is what it was about. These are the people who have continuously been punished just for being themselves. They've been punished for, and I'm not saying, let people walk their partners doing pup play at a park. That's not what we're talking about when it comes to not hiding. We're talking about having a space, having a time of year. It's one day, it's one parade. That's all we're asking for, where we can be centered and where we can show the people who are going to these parades, who are young and might want to belong to one of these communities or do, but are afraid to say it, we're fine, we made it, we're important, we're here, we're thriving. And without that representation, it's just TD and the cops and rainbow flags, and that doesn't tell the young queer folks that they're going to be okay. That's why it's really important to show that we can continue what we're doing and be fine.
Right. So a large focus on the diversity, because if you're a young Black boy who's I may be gay, and you're walking in and you only see cis straight white men or cis white men, you're going to be well, this is not for me, right? So Luna, would you like to talk on this as well?
Yeah, I think kink is, for whatever your sexual orientation is, it's a way of queering your sex. It's a way of unhitching from these heteronormative scripts that really don't serve anybody, even who they're designed to serve. And so expanding our pleasure in that way, and then having a space where we can get validated so that shame doesn't get in the way of our pleasure. So we start to live in ways that feel more free, that help us negotiate safer situations, that help us feel like we deserve to have our needs met, and we don't have to kind of, hope that this is our one experience, that someone's going to spank us or dom us, and we can actually raise our standards by feeling like we are seen, represented, and that we belong to communities. And I think that I feel that I'd love to hear the other panelists too, but I feel that the discourse around kink and pride has also made people think that people are anal fisting people in the middle of like a rainbow bubble show. I think kinksters have a sense of what's legal in public, you know, and what's appropriate. And so this again goes back to the sensationalization, in that if you are into anal fisting and you also wear a leather harness and you like being on a collar, then if we let you express your kink, it's somehow just going to be out of control. So it really isn't a desire that's born from anything that is rooted in common sense. It is about shaming. It is about trying to make standards for a community that has historically been invisible and still faces shame. And the intersections for heterosexual people who are engaging in kink, it's not the same. Like we're not talking about what their representation is in queerness at Pride.
So Sarah, I want to ask you finally about this question. Like, how does like a politicized, non-rainbow washed Pride celebration centering kink, how does that elevate, you know, what we're trying to do? How does that elevate the diversity?
Well, I think it just overall, like I agree with what both other panelists said. I just believe that being out there and being your authentic self can help to change perceptions overall about what kink is, what kink can be. I think kink should be visible at Pride for that. And simply just because, you know, of the last question, it is a part of our history. And I feel like it's a part of the history that shouldn't be washed away. But yeah, nothing much to add. You both answered very well.
I like that a lot. I think it keeps coming up that there's like this perception of kink that's like, it's dirty, it's wrong, it should be hidden away, and like as soon as you let people explore kink, they're gonna be, it's golden showers in the streets. You know what I mean? Like it's coming from everywhere. Think of the children. So from the history of paraphilias in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or our lovely friend, Miss DSM, to biased media tropes that portray kinky characters as bad guys, public perceptions of kink are often misguided and negative, just like we talked about. What are the strategies that we can use to educate more people about BDSM culture and change the public perception of kink? So we talked a little bit about this already, but Luna, could you go more in depth?
I think a lot of times the perceptions of kink that we get to see, or the representations, they're very paternal. So they're very much about somebody knows exactly what you want, and then they're going to give it to you real good. And it's not an empowering version of erotic exploration, of erotic creativity. And a more empowered version would be if we start to show, I think someone mentioned like the aftercare piece, and we start to show the negotiation and how that's like dirty communication, leaving these little breadcrumbs to get where you want to go later. And I think also showing representations, or educating people on there's an important part of technique, but technique is also the activity you want to do, whether it's spanking or rope or whatever. That's a vessel for yourself, with the parts of yourself that you have come here to discover, that you've come here to engage. And so that's where we get things like spanking can be playful, spanking could be painful, spanking could be, you know, about a particular role play. And so having people have more communication skills and having us have more role models for that, normalizing that, sexifying that is going to help also reduce I feel like for myself, I had so much meandering because I didn't know what to ask for. I was just going by, you know, who has a lot of power in these communities, which is like cis male doms. And so that's where I did a lot of my learning, and then had to unlearn all of that stuff. And I think the representations need to be diverse on so many levels and so many community spaces, or whether that's a festival, or, you know, it's Pride, or it's you know, something else that's engaging people together around kink. We can't be searching for, you know, people who aren't cis, white, thin, young, you know, women. Like we can't have that as representing our community, or else people aren't going to come to these events that are diverse, or they're going to come and have a really bad time. So I think also like it's some education towards, or demanding, not so much education, but like advocacy towards these festivals or organizers. I mean, that's how we saw changes in the leather community. That's how we saw changes in rope. And but it's still really tough. It's really tough. I mean, it's hard unless you're plugged into the community to be able to find representation. And so if you're new to it, it can just feel overwhelming, and you sort of accept what's there.
Absolutely. Sarah, I know you have experience with education when it comes to, you are an educator. I said it in the intro, and I don't lie ever. So, what is your opinion on how education on BDSM culture and on kink can change public perception?
Yeah, I think it can change public perception by just combating the stereotypes that are out there. I think on a personal level, like a way that you can educate people is just, educating people if they happen to say a joke, or, which is how a lot of misconceptions come up about kink. They'll just be like an offhanded joke about something. And I feel like calling out and calling in people is probably one of the, I don't want to say easiest things to do because it can be intimidating, but one of the best things that we can do to try and change misconceptions and break stereotypes. Just letting people know that though this person might not mean harm by what they're saying, it can harm the people that it's about. But yeah, I feel like other than that, like in a bigger sense, when it comes to media portrayals, for instance, it's also like calling in and calling out, media companies or the creators of the media, just to let them know that, it's not okay. And yet again, just letting them know the harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because media really does affect perception on kink. Like Jade said, 50 Shades of Grey has done irreparable damage to perceptions of kink. Perceptions that will last for so long because they'll never have another way of combating that perception, right? So, Jade, can you speak a little bit about that?
I can speak a lot about that. When I think of 50 Shades specifically, like I think it's something that we should talk about or can talk about. If we're going to talk about kink and we're going to talk about education around it, the woman who wrote those books had no idea that they were going to get so incredibly popular. And there was actually an SNL sketch about it, about the books, and about how there was this whole thing about how moms everywhere were like not realizing that they were interested in certain things until they read those books. And I don't want to put too much onus on this author because, again, she didn't really know that it was going to blow up the way that it did. But at the same time, if you are going to represent a certain community, if you're going to write from the perspective of someone who belongs to it, if you are going to write from the perspective of someone who's exploring it, I think it's really important, even if the character that you're writing, for example, doesn't know about this community or about this topic, that you do. Because one of the biggest problems I find is that, especially with 50 Shades, there is such an in-depth look at the relationship between the two main characters and Christian Grey's relationship with kinkiness and BDSM. And it just feeds a false narrative that everyone who is into BDSM and kink is that way or feels that way because of some sort of trauma, and that they're only engaging with it to cope with it or avoid dealing with it. And there's so much harmful representation, or playful but harmful representation, of kink just for the sake of making shocking art and making something like, oh, now it's not that, exceptional to have a sex scene, so now let's have a sex scene where someone's getting whipped or spanked. And something that I actually love is that there is a wholesome representation of kink, in a way, in the DC universe, which is Wonder Woman. If you have Netflix, you can watch Dr. Marston and I think and the Wonder Woman, I think it's called, or Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, which is about the person who wrote Wonder Woman. And this person was a kinky polyamorous, was in a relationship, exploring rope play and putting that into his art. And it was a very subtle way of sort of normalizing it, I suppose. But at the same time, it's important that mainstream media or anyone who is going to represent this community is going to do it well. If you're going to do it thoroughly, you need to do it very, very well. And you need to be on top of that. And I agree with Sarah about calling in people when they make harmful jokes and saying things like that. And as a comedian, I actually really like to talk about things that are difficult to teach about or discuss by making jokes about them. I talk about being non-binary. I talk about being Black. I talk about being Black and non-binary and bisexual. And I like to do that, especially so when I've walked through the room before my set and I see how white the audience is. I'm like, I'm going to do all of my queer, all of my Black material, because I think the people that need to hear about this that are scared to ask are here. And so I think it's important to engage when you have the energy with folks that are not involved as much, because I know that it's nice and comfortable to engage with the people that you know agree with you. But there are times, depending on where you exist, especially socially, and the energy that you might have in response to that, I think it's really important to make sure that you're surrounded by people who know what's up.
Right.
And if not, then tell them.
Yes, period. So I think you said something really interesting earlier on when you were talking about how there's this kind of concept of you use kink to work out your trauma. Girls with daddy issues like daddy kink. You know what I mean? So I want to ask you, all three of you, as people who are, in the kink communities, who are experienced with kink, how can kink and sexual pleasure be tools of overall wellness, mental health, and trauma recovery? And I know you just talked about it, Jade, but I am going to ask you again because I know you lead self-care workshops. So I want to ask you what your opinion is on that.
My opinion on this, and just to clarify, it's not a bad thing to say that people who are into kink are into kink because of trauma. Like it's just the narrative that trauma has negatively impacted a person who's now turned to something that they otherwise wouldn't have. I think that's where the problem is, because it can be and is often a very healthy way to explore healing by reclaiming certain aspects of sexual expression that have made you feel unsafe, or areas of which you felt violated or been abused or whatever it is. And I won't go into too much detail, just to make sure that everyone's okay with what's being talked about. But it is a way that you can, again, in a safe, welcoming environment, explore certain areas of your sexual expression that you have felt unsafe even thinking about or visiting in the past. And so, yes, I teach self-care workshops. And I think to me, it's self-care to make sure that, you can explore something that might be healing, and just make sure that if you do that and you find that that's not what's happening, one of the beautiful things about, this is with sex in general, but there's a focus on it in kink specifically, is that the communication and consent that happens is all, I would say, more active than when it comes to vanilla sexual expression. It's always supposed to be active and enthusiastic. That's all it is. That's what consent is. But there's something about kink specifically, especially when you're exploring something new, where there's sort of a focus on what's happening moment by moment that I think allows people to process things and be more present. And that is healing, like being able to go through that process.
Yeah. I like the idea of the safe environment, sexual expression, and how that promotes mental wellness. Like those together help you, go through that. So Luna, do you want to talk a little bit more about that mental wellness and overall wellness?
Sure. I think for a lot of people, when they're living with sexual shame, whether it's around kink or their other aspects of their sexuality, it creates so many different blocks. So you've got this emotional block, you've got a mental block, and then you also have a physical block because you're not seeking out the sensations, or it's hard to be present in a body that's not responding to the environment that you've created, right? It wants something different. And it wants to feel safe in those environments. A lot of people will describe kink and kink experiences help you go into altered states, and to go into an altered state like subspace or dom space or something in between, it really has to be about a sense of I trust this environment, I trust this person. Or if you're doing kink on your own, you're self-tying, you're doing other kinds of self kink, it is also about trusting the process and the sensations. And when we're dealing with dark or uncomfortable emotions or sensations, there is also the same body response. So we're still getting a flood of intensity. We're still getting hormones and adrenaline and all kinds of feel good chemicals going for us. Our body's not registering, like, oh, this is fear in a contained context with boundaries versus the fear that's outside and that you don't have any control over, and you can't coordinate, you don't know how to tap out, there's no aftercare. And I think people they do confuse using kink as therapy, but kink is not therapy. I mean, kink is something that might be a part of your healing journey. It can help you access things that maybe therapy can't. But I think that's where I've heard a lot of misconception around, oh, well, I do this thing because, this happened. And if that's the only thing you're doing to take care of yourself with whatever is needing that care, I find that a little bit unbalanced. I think there's there's some more digging to do, and it makes sense to me, because if you're keeping this thing that's shameful, and so you don't want to talk to a therapist about it, maybe you don't want to include that as part of your self-discovery, and there aren't a lot of kink friendly therapists, there's basically, even sex therapists would have to be sex positive to really understand BDSM is not something that's inherently dysfunctional. And I think for a lot of people, the healing also comes because we can pivot into parts of ourselves, and that allows us to rediscover ourselves. So if I pivoted into dominance and in a sexual context, I still get the benefits of that self-discovery and that experience in a non-sexual context. And so I've learned to identify my own needs. I've learned to be more receiving in situations. I'm a huge people pleaser. So doming is a learned skill for me, in a sense of being able to learn from somebody else what they want and how to deliver that. And so it helps me, negotiate like a better cell phone contract or something. And so I'm not doming the cell phone person, but I'm using the confidence, I'm using the skills, I'm even using the breath to be able to stand there when all of my people pleaser alarms are going off. And so I think that people can gain skills for self-development, for healing, for wellness.
That's great. I love that. That kink as a form of self-discovery, I think, is really important. And you have to know yourself to be able to know that I'm receiving pleasure from this. I am in this moment and it's good, So Sarah, would you like to give us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I honestly don't have too much more to add. I think both those answers were super great and in depth. I think that kink and sexual pleasure can be a grounding experience, and can not only just act as like a pleasant distraction from whatever might be going on in your life, but also just a way to recenter ourselves and our bodies. I think that they can be an outlet for how we can reclaim our own bodies and minds, and because they provide pleasure rather than pain and negative emotions. But yeah, that's about it that I can add.
Yeah, that's honestly it. It seems like we're all in agreement. And that actually brings us to the end of our moderated session, like of our pre-organized questions. And now I'm gonna like open up the space. So if you would like to submit a question through the Q&A function, you can absolutely do that. You can do that at any time, and then I will go through the questions, and our panelists should feel free to just like unmute and answer as you want. You can raise your hand if you want. It's not class or anything, so I'm not going to be like, no, don't speak until your hand's raised. I'm holding back trauma from Catholic school, you can tell. But feel free to answer if the question sparks something in you. So we do have a couple of questions already, which is very exciting. So oh, this is actually a very good question. This is my question. Why is it so expensive to participate in some kink communities? Have you seen how expensive a good puphood is? What are some affordable / free ways to participate or challenge kink capitalism? Where is the trademark for that one? Kink capitalism, but also support kink positive business. Anyone can answer, or I'm gonna start picking people. I'm so sorry.
I can answer, because I have a story of where I was doing pup play with someone, and I was at the dollar store, and I was buying, like, I had a bowl and a harness and like pee pads, and I was handing them over to the cashier, and she said, she's like, "Oh, what kind of dog is it? Is it a big dog or a small dog?" And I was like, "What dog?" And I was just like, "Yes." So,
it is a dog.
Sure, I don't know. So I think it's so true that so much of this stuff is like, if you're into latex, you're into leather, you're into anything with like really rich materials like that, that's going to be a barrier. And so I would think about, what is it like? So for the pup hood, for example, is it about a further kind of expressing puppy features? Is it about having a mask that sort of takes away your human features? And so if you kind of find your attraction to something, there are sometimes ways you can mimic that experience or sensations using household stuff. Maybe you get a cheaper mask and you put some ears on. Like, you might have to do some DIY to decide if this is like, oh my God, yes, this is my thing. And then trying to find local makers is great, but local makers, they're crafters and they're entrepreneurs. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be cheaper. They're probably charging the actual cost for the thing. So I would also look on places like Etsy. You might look on places in your local community where there might be kink gear swapping. And so sometimes people will put up used gear. Some things are harder to sanitize than other things, but there are ways to kind of try and explore. If you're into things that are more like big furniture, you think one day I'll have a St. Andrew's cross in my home. When things open up, then going to places where you can experience something before investing in it is also a good way to get around some of the costs.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Lena. Jade, Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add, or you can go into?
Yeah, I was just typing in to the chat as well. I have a friend who runs what's currently an online queer marketplace with a bunch of different vendors. I'm not 100% sure if there are folks who sell any kind of kink gear on there, but I think that I have seen some vendors that do sell that. I can't speak to affordability, and like Luna said, things are unfortunately going to cost a little bit more, especially if you're buying from someone local. It might cost more because they're not able to mass produce and just sell to a big box store. Not that big box stores are selling leashes and pup masks, but maybe one day. That's honestly the dream. Maybe one day we'll have like good quality but affordable, like a kink section in like Costco or something.
No more Spencers. No more back of Spencers. Sarah?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I used to work at a sex store for a few years, so I definitely know the price of some things, especially in our latex section. But I feel like I'm a fan of DIY in general. I live the DIY life, and I feel like, especially if someone is just entering into kink for the first time, there's so many ways you can do it. I mean, you can just, go into your closet and grab a silk tie, or grab an eye mask. Like, there's so many cheap alternatives to stuff that, are sold in stores. Because if you're just trying stuff out for the first time, you also don't necessarily know what you might be into. So you don't want to drop the money. But yeah, when customers would come in and they would be like loading up their baskets and we would be chatting. And I said, if they were trying to buy a leather collar. And I said, like, you can just go to a pet store and, there's more options as well. There's just alternatives everywhere that aren't just in sex stores that you can find.
Cool. That's great. Okay. Next question. We actually have a lot of questions, so I'm very excited. I'm gonna go with a shorter question just so we can get to everything. What is the difference between a fetish and a kink? Now we're in the grammar lessons. Now we're in the definitions. Jade?
I don't know if you could see what I was saying, but I was like, Luna, are you going to take this one?
Okay.
Because I was like, I think I know that.
Sorry.
I can
Luna,
take it,
go
you can
ahead.
add to it. That's totally fine. A fetish is usually something that's focused on either body parts or objects or things that are not inherently sexual, that we don't consider part of like sex. And for some fetishes, that specific arousal might be the only pathway for them to get off. So there might be this very strong attraction to this object of attraction. And so the word fetish actually comes from religion. And so we fetishize objects as having been imbued with special powers. So a chalice or a cross or things like that become sort of idolatry. And that's what we're doing with fetishism. So when someone says they have a fetish for breasts, that just means they really like breasts, but breasts are already considered pretty sexual. So it's not really a fetish. Fetish would be like a shoe fetish, or you have a fetish for casts, or I don't know, like whatever. Like you could have a fetish for anything. When we talk about kink is the sort of the umbrella for BDSM and fetish. So kink doesn't have to have BDSM in it. You can be kinky without doing any BDSM or any fetish. And kink usually is just implying something that you're doing that society doesn't consider normal sex.
Yes. Yes. Definitions. Okay. I don't know if any of our other panelists want to add on to that or no? Okay. Everyone is very happy with Luna's definition. Okay. Can you talk a little bit more about kink and aftercare? I find that I don't see aftercare represented as often. Go ahead, Jade.
Yeah, this is something that I was talking about earlier, is how aftercare is not represented. And I won't go into too many details, but I sort of learned through a personal experience that it is most of the time essential. And if not, what I would say is that it's essential to be talked about, is if your partner requires aftercare or if you require aftercare. And essentially what that means is just that you have I'll say an aftercare session after your scene or play has come to a close, where you check in on your partner and you care for them. Really, you would essentially be checking in on the person, assuming that there's a power dynamic involved in the scene. You would be checking on the person who is on the receiving end of certain things. For example, if you're doing impact play, or if it's just a sort of dom sub situation, you would check in on the sub and maybe bring them water, maybe snuggle, kind of see if they're okay. Talk about what worked, maybe talk about what didn't, maybe you don't talk. Aftercare can look like a lot of different things, but really it's about checking in with each other. And if there is someone who's in a sort of, and if you're doing a power dynamic, if you're the person who is in the position of power or essentially taking on the role of the dominant person is going to be the one who's checking in on their sub or their bottom or whatever it is.
Cool. Additions?
I just want to add that sometimes I've heard that their partners like don't want to give them aftercare, or it's a kinky hookup, so there's no aftercare. So that doesn't eliminate that you might still have a need for aftercare, and so it's fully okay, like Jade said, to have a plan. And so your plan might be you call your kinky BFF, or that you put on your favorite no brain kind of thinking show on Netflix. And really aftercare is about coming down. It's about returning to ourselves and reintegrating all of those parts of ourselves that we pulled apart, so that we could have this burst of erotic energy and erotic creativity. And I also find too, I mean, as a top or someone who likes doming, I'm a switch, but I tend to dom or top. And I also need aftercare. And so sometimes my aftercare is that subs have to clean up all my stuff. I hate when they leave and then I'm like, oh my God, my whole house, there's rope everywhere. And so, if that's not possible for, for the submissive, then I also want something that sort of honors me and that honors that maybe I had to be a bully and I'm not actually a bully. So you might need reassurance at the end of it. I definitely need that. You might need to check in that everything was okay because you were the producer of like the whole scene and there was all this responsibility on you. And so you want to be accountable. Did they really have a good experience? Did they get what they wanted? Did they not speak up when they wanted to speak up? So these kinds of things might also take time to digest. You might not need aftercare till like 3 days later when you come back into yourself and you're like, oh shit, like I like whipped someone or someone whipped me. And what does that say about me? And so having that communication, even if it's a hookup, even if it's pickup play, even if it's, and it's okay to also say, I only do these kinds of activities if aftercare is available. And if not, then, let's do something else. I actually think aftercare should be part of all sex. I think it should be something that, it's kind of implying that we don't have an emotional experience when we have sex. And so you might not have a romantic or an emotionally invested experience, but you're a person. You have emotions. Every interaction is emotional. So I think that I learned so much from kink that makes me even a better non-kinky partner about communication, about aftercare, even saying, hey, do you want to hang out for like 10 minutes after, do you want to kind of like talk about your favorite parts or things like that? It can just really give us skills that help us be more empathetic partners.
What can parameters of play in the BDSM community teach us about establishing and maintaining consent in our interactions with one another? So it's literally what you just touched on. I don't know if Sarah, would you like to answer this one?
Yeah, I feel like consent is pretty central to kink. Consent is never implied. It's generally understood in the kink community that consent is an important decision between the partners or the people engaging. And I feel like in our everyday lives, consent is necessary. Constant checking in is necessary. Just with interacting with friends or family or peers, it's like, I might be happy one day and, accepting hugs and I'm into deep conversations. And the next day I might have, something going on and I'm not present enough to really, interact with anyone to that extent. So I feel like, the checking in that comes with consent is necessary to our everyday lives because of that.
Luna, Jade, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the conversations around consent that are happening right now, sort of on a global scale, are really fascinating to see unfold. People are checking in with each other in ways that we sort of realized a lot of us growing up we didn't. And we're sort of reflecting and thinking, oh, I didn't engage properly. Or, you might meet someone who's like, I'm a hugger, and they hug you, and you think about it, and you're like, that made me uncomfortable, but should I just get over it? And then you sort of realize, like, nobody actually gets to touch me unless I say that they can. And so there's a conversation or an ideology, I suppose, around kink and consent that actually does exist everywhere and is necessary everywhere. It's just that now we're realizing that there are certain ways that we shouldn't be engaging physically with other people without consent ever. Like hugging someone that you don't know is always open to hugs, or even when someone needs to pass by you and if they've said something or if they haven't tried to say excuse me and they just tap you on the shoulder, or unfortunately this has happened many times where an older man will put their hand on my back or lower back to sort of scooch by me, and I'm going to start throwing hands when that happens, because I get that there might have been a time or there might have been people in that person's life who didn't say anything or who were okay with it. But ultimately, if you don't know someone, you should not be engaging with them physically in any way that they haven't agreed to, either verbally or by extending some sort of response. Or, if you go like this to hug someone and they go like this back, that can sort of be implied that they're saying, yes, I'll hug you. But ultimately, the thing about kink that can teach us about interacting with people in everyday life is that you're not ever, whether you're whipping somebody or tying them up or just giving them a hug or just scooching by them or whatever it is, you're really not supposed to touch anybody who doesn't want you to. And that's most people.
That's great. I honestly, the amount of middle class white straight men who are just like, I'm just gonna scooch by you there and put your hand on you and be like, I'm going to send you to God. I'm going to, you are going to meet who made you. So, another question here. This one's a little more serious. Tips for navigating past trauma and kinky fantasies that sometimes come into conflict with another. Now, there's a content warning on this, for example, for just a light mention of sexual assault. For example, trauma related to sexual assault at a young age and desires for age play / BDSM.
I can answer, I think, a part of it. I think, so many of us have trauma in different ways. And so even the trauma of living in, patriarchy and really sometimes I have fantasies and I think, oh my God, I'm so fucked up. Like that was so hot, but I'm so fucked up. So our body really and our imagination and our mental health, they all kind of come together to help us have ways where we can cope with this pleasure or cope with this pain. So it might throw pleasure at it. It might develop a pleasure response. And so for a lot of people also that have experienced sexual assault, there are challenges with getting back into the body. And so that disconnection that happened when the trauma happened, it continues to grow. It continues to be sort of a lump in us. And so to be able to go to that space and to find pleasure in that space can be a way where we can find a healing or coping or even just joy, right? And just trying to reclaim some of that. And so if you're going to do this, you don't have to disclose your trauma every single time you want to do age play with somebody. What you need to know is your triggers and what things are going to send you into spaces that are more uncomfortable than pleasurable. And it's impossible to know every single trigger. So you might know what the big ones are, but your person might say something else. And so when you're engaging in a play where there is a very vulnerable part of you that is going to be experienced, you want to be able to say very clearly, here are the words that are really good for me. Here are the words that are not good for me, like don't baby talk me or don't call me that or whatever your turnoffs are that put you into a place. So it's not just hard boundaries. It's not just I'm not into scat, I'm not into, it really is going deeper into what is going to create an emotionally and physically safe experience that is very clearly boundaried. And I would also work, instead of just having a safe system, work with something or a safe word, work with a safe system so that you can check in with the intensity of the scene. It might go too deep. And so you might want to call a 3 because you're getting close to the 5 where it's super intense for you. I think the other thing is that a lot of times, especially when our fantasies are driven by something really powerful in us, whether it's trauma or something else, it's sometimes hard to come up with these boundaries. It's hard to come up with, here's what I want to feel, here's what I don't want to feel, because it's so intense. And so a lot of times I see people really wanting to have the other person take control in a way that's outside of the scene. And so they want their top, they want their dominant, they want whoever to make it feel real for them. That is, and we are all personally accountable in kink, and we can have shared accountability where it's appropriate, but at the end of the day, it's also about how are you going to take care of yourself if something does happen. Do you feel comfortable talking to this person? Do you have someone else you can talk to? Is there a way for you to process this something if it becomes re-traumatized? And for other people, this is really only safe with other supports that are helping guide them. I teach a lot at the Toronto Rape Crisis Center, and my assumption at first, I went in to teach classes and I was like, oh, I'm not going to talk about BDSM. It's going to be so triggered. Everybody asked me about BDSM afterwards because it's intense and it's focused. And it also comes out of a script where maybe that script also was at play in the conditions where you were harmed. And so it's a way of reclaiming that pleasure that was created or that was lost through the disconnection of yourself to your body.
Great. Thank you so much, Luna. Oh, Here's one. This one will be fun for everyone, I promise. Are there kinky queer books that you would recommend? Luna, you looked very excited, but Jade, we'll go to Jade, and then we'll go to Luna.
I don't have any specific books that I can recommend, but I can tell you where to find them, which would be, this is a very shameless plug for Glad Day Bookshop, which, if you haven't heard of it already, is the oldest queer bookstore in Toronto, and before the Pandora was also an event space and will hopefully be an event space again very soon when it's safe to do so. They are currently taking online orders. You can pick up from them at their open window. Their hours are posted online. If they don't have a book that you want, which you can call to ask if they do, they can also order it for you. Or they'll let you know if they can't, but they're really good at tracking certain things down if they don't have them available in store.
And not just queer, like kinky books, like queer books in general. Glad Day is a really great resource for. So, Luna?
I also second Glad Day. Also, Come As You Are is a queer-owned, trans-owned sex shop that is also a worker co-op, and it just reopened physical space in Kensington. So you can actually go in and like look at books, and their book collection is awesome. So they do have queer, kink, erotic fiction. There are also things that are about queering kink, so more like more nonfiction stuff on kink. If you're looking for a collection of stories, I really like Her Body and Other Parties, I think it's called. Let me try and find it. Anyways, I'll put it in the chat for you. But it was one of the first books that I thought was, wow, this is hot, and it's got this expression stuff in it. I really react to things that don't feel enough like a story, like that pulls me in. If it's so like, well, then we broke down our identities and had tea and talked about our air sign. Like I want something to masturbate to. So there, maybe that's your thing, but like, you know, if you're looking for something that is as visceral as some of the other stuff that we see, I think that's a great one. So I'll drop that in the chat.
Cool. Sarah, do you have any recommendations? Also, movies has just come up also. So if there's movies that you recommend, that would also be great.
My mind is kind of going blank right now, and my cat is screaming at me from outside the door, which is a distraction. But one little book that I've been using more and more in my workshops and sharing with people is the Yes, I'm Flagging, Queer Flagging 101. How to use a hanky code to signal sex you want to have. I feel like over the past, and I could be wrong, I feel like over the past few years, the hanky code there's been a resurgence in a way. And different colors and patterns have been developed as well. So that's one. And I can also put the link in the chat.
Please do.
This is the Amazon link, but also don't use Amazon if you don't have to, but it's the first one that came up.
That honestly, there's a ton of resources in the city, which is really cool for queer literature, and it's queer literature written by queer people for queer people, which is honestly the most important part, because nothing really gets my goat like a queer book written by a straight person. So I'm gonna move on to the next question while we post some links in the chat. Part of the at odds conversation of kink and pride is kink in front of kids. And I think we mentioned this a little before. How can parents, or even just vanillas, navigate education and discussions on kink? Jade, go ahead.
A friend of mine was actually asking this question on Facebook because there was a debate that sort of erupted on their page in the comment section where most great debates happen. About this particular topic, and a lot of the parents were saying, you know, I want to go to Pride, I want to bring my kids to Pride, but they're not at an age where I can explain this to them yet, or I'm not sure how to. And to that, I would possibly say, if there is something, I think it was maybe it was Einstein. It was one of the geniuses that whose name we all know, who said at one point that if you're unable to explain something to someone like they're a child, then you probably don't know it that well. And I'm not necessarily going to say that I agree with that, but I would say that if there's something that you are either unable to or uncomfortable with explaining to your kids, then it's probably not the time to have them around it. Because I did used to be a kid, and when I was, and there was something that I would see that I was not allowed to understand, usually it was something I saw by accident. It was really frustrating and really alienating. And I know now, looking back, that I was just a child who wouldn't have understood. Like, I remember finding a condom in the back of my dad's car, and I'd just eaten ribs, so I thought it was a wet nap, and I opened it, and I was like, this isn't going to clean my hands. And nobody would tell me what it was, and I couldn't understand, because to me it just looked like a slimier version of the things that my grandmother put on her fingers when she's gardening. So I didn't get it, and it was frustrating, but that's why it shouldn't have been there. Or I guess at the same time it was good that it was there. And when it wasn't, that's when my siblings came along. But I think that as a parent, if you're hoping to bring your children to Pride events, it might be a conversation that you have to have with your co-parent if you're co-parenting, or even with your child, maybe, that there are going to be certain things that are displays of adult activity. And if you're able to say to your kid, not everything, this is another thing that I saw in the comment section that I found interesting, is there has to be a certain point maybe when you tell your kid, not everything is for you. And there are certain things that you will have to wait to access. There are certain things that it's much more accessible, I think, to say to a kid that there are certain things that belong to communities of older people, as opposed to saying, like, you won't get it. Because then, depending on the age and attitude of your kid, the kid's going to say, well, no, try me. Kids want to be smart. They want to be self-actualized. They want to be independent. And so I think if you're going to have that conversation with your kid, it's more something, this is actually for a group of people that are older. And so when you're a little bit older, I'll explain. And when you're older than that, you can decide if you want to participate. And then for folks, can you remind me what it said in the question about vanillas? Sorry.
Zoom, I will unmute myself. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
So even for just vanillas, how would you navigate education and discussion on kink? So people who aren't very well versed.
This is going to be short and blunt. If you're vanilla and you're an adult, learn. Look it up. Teach yourself. It's 1 month in the year. You have the rest of them.
Honestly, on that topic, somebody has asked, how can someone join Luna's class? How can they learn? So Luna, why don't you tell us a little bit about how we can join your classes?
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna pop my website in the comments. So all of my webinars are available online, like on demand, and every month I release new ones. And so if you want to attend something live, you can come to that. If you find that sometimes accessibility is an issue for tickets or things like that, I do a ton of free content. So you can find YouTube, my newsletter. I love teaching about this, and classes are great because they're a dedicated space of people who want also to learn. So the questions from people are really great, but it doesn't mean that you can't learn things. And I also think that there's something about when I first started learning kink, there wasn't as many people teaching kink. And so it was very limited. And I was learning a lot from FetLife or from like anecdotal experiences, and those have value too. There is wisdom from those experiences, but when someone is an educator, there's also a way of delivering information that's intersectional, that also considers lots of different aspects that people need to adapt a skill. And so I think it's sometimes, you can also learn from people's blogs, like learn from all the things that are out there, but definitely invest in yourself if you want to build skill, because the skill is not only a pleasure reward, it is also about safety and other people's safety, and going into it in a way that really meets everybody's needs. That isn't just about, because I also think, yeah, I love TikTok and Kink Talk. I think they're great. And it seems like it's also very, it's not kind of pushing the 50 Shades of Grey. I'm sure that that's a version of TikTok that I don't want to end up on. So I'm sure that's out there. but having all of these, I mean, there's so many things that are online now too, and being able to even level up. You know, maybe you've already done spanking. Cool. I always have kinksters coming to my class who then at the end of it will say, "Oh, thank you for validating everything that I already knew." And I'm like, okay, like there's always something for you to learn. There is always, if you leave a class that way, it means you came in like tunnel vision and you didn't consider that, oh, someone else does dominance like this. What if I meet someone who does, you know, it really is about being porous and having your boundaries and what's important to you, but then being porous to the perception. So if you see, you know, people they have their profiles that say things like, I'm a daddy dom and I'm this, I'm great. But you know, where are your skills in negotiating a scene? Where are your skills in consent? Are you going to shame me for speaking up because I'm a bottom? You know, we want to be able to articulate the questions that we need for our safety and our pleasure. And to do that, that's a skill. So if you feel confused about it, it's a skill. So don't worry, you'll get there.
Thank you so much, Luna. Okay, this is the last question. The last submitted question. It's open to everyone. Although, Luna, you actually just touched on it because apparently you and I are connected through a tube that connects our minds to each other. But kink play can be diverse in nature. What are some best tips for kink curious folks? That's true, we're both earth signs. Sorry. What are some of the best tips for kink curious folks beginning to explore play? Does BDSM have to necessarily be sexual? And that's open to anyone. I'm sorry for yelling about being an earth sign. Go ahead, Jade.
I can't answer this in too much detail, but I would definitely say that BDSM does not have to be, or kink or fetish. Well, fetish is different a little bit, but kink and BDSM do not have to be sexual, especially as you're learning. I think that if you're going into kink expecting to get off or climax every time, or in your first time doing a certain scene, that's it's possibly unrealistic, just because you're still figuring out what you like, you're still figuring out how comfortable you are with certain things, and depending on, I guess, your body's relationship and your relationship to just orgasming in general, a lot of people need to be really relaxed to achieve an orgasm, and so it's not a bad thing if you don't. I mean, there's a lot of times where I don't even think it's a bad thing if you don't achieve that. And I say achieve that as in reach it, not like it's an accomplishment. Goal-based pleasure is often less fun anyway, depending on the vibe. But yeah, it doesn't have to necessarily be sexual. You don't have to, if you feel that you want to explore kink and BDSM, but it's not for sexual reasons, you're still welcome to explore it. As long as you're being respectful, there's not a lot that I would say you shouldn't do in general.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jade. Sarah, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think with just the first part of the question for kink curious folks, I feel like my first tip would just be to not put too much pressure on yourself. You know, take time to find what works for you. Y'all have different relationships with our bodies and with each other, and finding what works might take time. And then after that, as mentioned before in this panel, communication is important. So I guess a tip would be to experiment and try new things with people that you communicate well with, because it'll just make the whole experience better and more comfortable.
Amazing. Okay. Luna, last thoughts on this?
Yeah, Jade, did your hand go up? Were you wanting to say something? You can jump in.
I was just thinking, for tips, I was gonna say maybe watch some videos, watch some porn, just to see That's it.
Yeah, I was gonna suggest too. I think porn is great if you're looking for queer feminist porn that's also kinky. Crash Pad series is awesome, and pay for your porn. Pay for your porn. If you can't pay for your porn, you can't get a membership. Definitely look at queer erotica online. So Reddit is a shit show, but there is a lot of good stuff on there. So if you can find the BDSM queer parts, that's so great. I also highly recommend the Book of Topping and the Book of Bottoming. If you're interested in any kind of power exchange, read both, because oftentimes we're getting anecdotal information that isn't it isn't like skeletal enough. You know, it's a skeleton. We need a skeleton to build our own fantasy into it. And yeah, take my classes.
Thank you so much. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our Q&A session, which also brings us to the end of the panel. I want to close this discussion out by thanking our speakers for dedicating their time, their experience, their perspectives, and their warnings about my muting. I want to thank you. It is so important that we have these discussions as a community, especially at a time where we're supposed to be together uh, in person. I'm going to post where you can find all of our speakers on social media in the chat right now. So that's all of their Instagrams. There's Jade's OnlyFans. There's Luna's website. And yeah, all of their Instagrams. I'd also like to thank the YFS and CSACs for contributing to the organization and facilitation of this talk. I want to thank all of our attendees for your attention, for your participation, for your lovely questions. And I hope you all have a wonderful Pride Month. Yeah. Thank you so much.